fellow Lexophiles. This is Elizabeth at the Ashland Branch Library, and we're here today for another poetry break. This month, I've chosen poems by Claudia Emerson, who was Virginia's Poet Laureate in 2008, and who died, unfortunately, in 2014. The first three poems I'll share with you today is from her collection Late Wife, where the narrator tries to find love amid a series of life's cataclysms. This one is called Rent. There were 5 houses over 20 years. We lived almost a decade in one, a mild, shallow winter in another. We bartered work for rent in the last, the one that had already been let go. Privet crowded the porch, and a wall bowed into the parlor, abandoned honey swollen inside it, the plaster crazed. We would share that house with swallows in the chimney, with the black rat snake I'd find coiled in a basket of clothes or stretched out on the bed. Bumblebees purred as though with contentment under us, and spiders, seasonless, survived the broom to live in every corner. Their egg sacs hung like soft spun pearls. Every spring, the bedroom filled with termites flying, having come up from beneath the floor to mate and shed the brief wings I swept up like confetti. Committed, they returned to the narrowing crawl space to feed their queen. I imagined her pale and thick as my thumb, invalid, being fed the house, birthing more of what would keep her fed. When I worried the place would fall, you laughed. Not in our lifetime. That was true. It stood those years where it yet stands, where you remained without me, living, you would claim, another finer life, nothing the same. But I imagine the walls still disappear inside themselves, vacant forms, and the house grows lighter, a deceitful ruin that lingers, rising longer than it should above you, and the fertile hunger that will, with enough time, consume it before going on to another survival. This next poem is called Pitching Horseshoes. Some of your buddies might come around for a couple of beers and a game, but most evenings you pitched horseshoes alone. I washed up the dishes or watered the garden to the thudding sound of the horseshoe in the pit, or the practiced ring of metal against metal after the silent arc, end over end. That last summer, you played a seamless, unscored game against yourself, or night falling, or coming into the house. You were good at it. From the porch, I watched you become shadowless, then featureless, until I knew you couldn't see either. And still, the dusk rang out, your aim that easy, between the iron stakes you had driven into the hard earth yourself. You paced back and forth as if there were a decision to make, and you were the one to make it. The final poem from this specific collection is called The Practice Cage. I was taking my routine run, the same 3 miles, just past daybreak on the jogging trail that encircled the playing fields, the home of the Fighting Eagles. I'd run that course so many times, I imagined myself a goat, circling the invisible stake of the baseball diamond's off-season desolation. Scoreboard blank before the lightning sky. Behind the stands, I heard first the dozen crows that crowded around a practice batting cage, a metal-framed, room-sized rectangle, its sides and ceiling made of a thick, heavy net. Then I saw the cause of the complaint, a red-tailed hawk on the ground inside. I'd spend most of my life in the country before moving to this city. I'd seen hundreds of hawks, but what I knew of them was distant patience or an extreme diving speed or death. I walked towards the cage, and the crows rose, scattering. The hawk flew up into the corner, struggled there, twisting upside down, as though tearing this other sky with his talons, before going limp, still turned, wings splayed outward. Where I'd expect tension, fury, I saw instead the taming of despair. His eyes resigned to this, to me, softened somehow, as though with forgiveness. I could see where he'd flown in, one edge of the netting gapped, so I worked the knots to raise the hem higher while the bird hung, indifferent to my effort. So motionless, I was certain he was injured by the struggle. But when I spoke, urged him, tugged at the net below, he seamlessly let go from that stillness, dropped down and righted himself into flight, finding at once the wider gap, and was, with no wing beat at all, gone, clearing the lip of the stadium to disappear into the turning stand of poplars bordering the fields. I began my run again, then, elated by the sound of my own breathing, by my feet striking the ground beneath me, by knowing I would round that same turn time after time, to see again in that familiar emptiness something we had revised, an absence finished. The next two poems are from her collection Figure Studies, in which the narrator looks at a girls' school and tracks the girls through different phases of their life. This specific poem is called What They Want, and it has the epigraph, "They covet fields and seize them, and houses and take them away." Micah, chapter 2, verse 2. 1. The men faked a collective boredom, nodded, spat, bid, and would buy it all divided: pasture, tractor, flatbed, bulk barns. Then the house, where the auctioneer called, convincing us to bid for all we had desired, had coveted all those years. Her hats would go for one money: felt, fur, straw, the velvet one from which the feathers of an egret rose white and trembled, as though her head still turned to nod at us. He would make us admit it, make us wear what she wore, what yet bore her favorite scent, what we had sworn beneath the preacher's drone hissing we would not be caught dead in. 2. The story had its way with us, the way a bee bores first into the mouth of one rose and then another. They found her. Where? How many days? My word, my God, the coffin closed, of course. Can you imagine how sad? She died alone, we said. How sad. By the time we saw the doll wheeled out in its carriage, wicker white, it might as well have been her heart cradled, still warm. Held high above us like a long-awaited heir, old, infant, she delighted us. The bidding climbed, an aberrant vine, as the doll cried out her one vow, her eyes opening, then closing, inside the perfect form of her face. Oh, what we wouldn't give for her. The second poem is called Piano Fire. How she must have dreaded us and our sweaty coins, more than we hated practice, the lessons, scales, the winter hot parlor, arthritic hands, the metronome's tick. She lectured to us about the history of the piano. Baby and concert grand, spinet and player had come across oceans in the holds of ships, across continents in mule-drawn wagons, heavier than all the dead left behind. On her face, we could see the worry. The struggle had come to this, the black upright she had once loved, haunting the room it could never leave. And her piano was now one of a mute, discordant population, doomed to old folks' homes, bars, church basements, pool halls, funeral parlors, or, more mercifully, abandoned on back porches where at least chickens could nest and the cat could have kittens. So when she could no longer play well enough, even to teach us, she hired some of the men to haul out and burn the piano in the field behind the house. We watched the keys catch, furious, and all at once heard in the fire a music-like relief. When the several tons of tension let go, heat becoming wind on our faces, we learned that when true ivory burns, the flame is playful, quick, and green. And in the ash, last lessons, the clawed brass feet we had never noticed before, the harp's confusion of wire, and the pedals we'd worn thin, shaped like quenched hard tongues, loud, soft, sustained. We waited with her until they were cool enough to touch. Our final 3 poems come from one of her last collections called The Impossible House, which was a series of poems that she wrote before she died and are very much about aging and mortality. So this first one is called Clear Cut and has the epigraph, "A wounded deer leaps highest," by Emily Dickinson. Her body is already harvested of its children, its quickness, both breasts, its work, most worry, all regret, the interval of sorrow behind her now. They planted the loblollies for this, the old age they had faith in, hers alone. Neighbors despair that she would make wasted acres where those trees had once stood for so long, that they believed them ownerless given. But if let be, they would sicken and fail, he had said, all at one, slowed once. And so the men began cutting, inescapable the sound of chainsaw cough and stutter, the felling, men calling out to one another as though desperate for something. The drag of chained logs through the mud, engines downshifting for days, weeks, the stench of resin, gas, sawdust, oil, exhaust. Then the controlled burn, smoke fog close to the ground, wafting toward and then away from the house, before the quiet of replanting seedlings, trees she does not even bother to imagine. Deer return to the yard, preferring apples still hanging over those easier fallen in the shadowy grasses. She watches a doe's slow rise on hind legs, as though in a freezing leap, not of the wounded, but of the resolve. In its mouth, what looks like a small sphere of sweetest ice. Beyond it, she is able to take in the made road, a broader swath of sky, a mile of air, that much clarity. Our second poem is called Darling. She misses the classes, but occupies everyone's office hours. Knees hugged up tight against her chest, she rocks lightly in a straight-backed chair, then lingers in the doorway, past whatever question she makes believe she had, her laughter decorative, another piercing. She wears her grandmother's watch on a chain, its only measure her breathing as she recites her many sonnets. Gaunt, she swaddles herself in gauzy scarves, jeans sewn tight against her calves in bright, neat stitches. She reports cutting herself out of them at night, another rule she follows strictly, wildly, as though to perfect or punish the darling form she has mistaken for self. And our last poem for the entirety of today is called Locke and has another Emily Dickinson epigraph, which says, "I noticed the quick wore off of those things," referring to daguerreotypes. This evening includes a reception, wine, and hors d'oeuvres with the curator, light-hearted discussion of the various diagnoses, hypotheses long debated, depression, lesbianism, grief, agoraphobia, the kind of anxiety a cat has about the threshold, and the most recent theory, epilepsy. That would explain it all, they say. Spasmodic punctuation, reclusiveness, the shame, everything. The hour of lead, at last, unlocked. On display, one of her beloved nephew Gilbert's boyhood suits, velveteen, and beside it the contents of his morning pockets, a bullet-spent casing, a wad of tangled strings, drafts of the more famous poems bearing clearly the needle piercings where she sewed one to another, the sutures of a fascicle's finished undone, what is thought to be the only image ever made of her, of which she disapproved here itself, as yet without compare. And next to it, the something rare, unexpected lock of her hair, the shape and circumference reminiscent of a sparrow's nest, the color likened to a chestnut burr. She had brushed, cut, coiled, and folded it into an envelope and sent it to someone, letter-like. Everyone lines up to photograph it with their phones, when what they must truly desire is to touch it, as though they might feel the sheen it retains. And while they can never get close enough, they will never be any closer than this to what it does not tell them. And they are desperate for all that that might mean. Thank you so much for joining me this time, and I'll see you next time.